Hello to you. I do hope you're well. Welcome to this A-level religious studies video. I'm Ben Wardle, and today we are revising St. Thomas Aquinas's natural moral law. So this video will cover everything you need to know in terms of your AO1 knowledge and your AO2 evaluation for an A-star. So let's get started with an overview of the key concepts within natural moral law that we'll be talking through in today's video. And we'll start by looking at Aristotle's influence on Aquinas. And we'll look in particular at his ideas of telos, eudaimonia, and reason. And we'll be talking about how they influenced Aquinas and how he incorporated them into his natural moral law. We'll then look at Aquinas' 4 tiers of law, at the eternal, divine, natural, and human laws, and we'll talk about that hierarchy before we look at the Synderesis principle, the idea that humans should do good and avoid evil in everything that they do. This then leads us to Aquinas' 5 primary precepts, which he said all people need to follow in order to achieve eudaimonia and flourishing. Those 5 primary precepts then lead to the secondary precepts. We will then have a look at Finnis's contemporary version of natural moral law before looking at Aquinas' doctrine of double effect and also at the contemporary development known as proportionalism. And then in terms of our AO2, we'll look at the strengths of natural moral law and then the weaknesses of natural moral law as well. So let's get started with all of this, shall we? With a look at some of the key quotes that you can use in your essay in order to secure an A-star. And remember, in order to get that A-star, we need to make sure we are referring to scholars and what they've said throughout our essay. So here are some of the brilliant key quotes you could use in order to secure that A-star on this topic. Cicero said that there will be one law eternal, binding upon all people at all times. And of course, that reflects the fact that Aquinas' natural moral law is designed to be universal. Those 5 primary precepts, he believed, should be followed by all people at all times. Cicero also said that natural moral law is right reason in agreement with nature. Now, importantly, Cicero actually predates Aquinas and his natural moral law. He was a Stoic philosopher, so he was around a lot earlier than Aquinas, but we can still use these quotes because it shows again the influence on Aquinas. He saw the role of reason as being very, very important, and he believed that we can work out the right thing to do. We can work out the natural law by using right reason in accordance, in agreement with nature. We then have a quote from Aquinas himself. He said that to the natural law belongs everything to which a man is inclined according to his nature. Aquinas also said that natural law is the same for all men. So again, reflecting its universal application. He said there is a single standard of truth and right for everyone. And actually, that's a really great link to meta-ethics as well, isn't it? When we're talking about what is the good. And he said it is also known by everyone. He wants everyone to use reason, which he sees as a God-given gift for humanity, in order to work out the natural law. So morality is not something to be invented by humans. It is something to be discovered by them, using their ability to reason. Aquinas also said that good is to be done and evil avoided, and that is his Synderesis principle. We've then got a more contemporary quote here from John Waters. He said that natural moral law is a foundational, universal, and absolute approach to ethics. So that's actually a really great description of it for your AO1 marks, but also you can use that as an AO2 strength as well, because he is a contemporary scholar speaking quite highly here about natural moral law and its value. We'll also talk about another John. We'll talk about John Finnis, who develops his contemporary version of natural moral law, but more on that to come a little bit later on. Just one more key quote for now is from Aquinas again, and this one is about his doctrine of double effect. He said that nothing hinders one act from having 2 effects, only one intended. And we'll talk about the doctrine of double effect a little bit later as well. But before we get onto that, let's just talk through some of the key headlines that you need to know about natural moral law. So you need to know that it is an ethical theory developed in its Christian form by St. Thomas Aquinas. And it's really important we emphasize that this is the Christian form. As I said, natural law predates Aquinas. He was very influenced by many, many earlier philosophers. He was influenced by Aristotle, as we're going to talk about today, but he was also influenced by Stoic philosophers such as Cicero, who had their own idea of natural law. And Aquinas took those ideas, he was inspired by those ideas, and he incorporated them into his Christian version of natural moral law. So his version is based on the key belief he held that the world and human life has a purpose given by God. So we're going to talk about telos, which is the idea that everything has a purpose, and Aquinas believed that that purpose comes from God. He also believed that the world has a natural order designed by God, and he believed that God is the creator of all things, including morality. We do not create morality, but we discover it. For example, through the divine law, so the commandments we read about in scripture, and then of course the natural law as well. And that's about using your right reason in accordance with nature in order to discover God's universal laws. So it's really important with natural moral law. And again, this is a great link to metaethics, that Aquinas believes God has created a moral law in human nature. So we are meant to discover it rather than decide for ourselves what is right and what is wrong. He said that this natural law should be universally followed by all people, and that it is discoverable through the use of human reason. So they are the headlines about natural moral law, and we're going to look at them in more detail throughout today's video. So let's start with a quick look at the 4 key concepts that I think you really need to remember for when you're writing about natural moral law. The first is the 4 tiers of law. Aquinas believed that there are 4 tiers of law, with eternal law at the top. We then have divine law, followed by natural law, and at the bottom we have human law. Our second key concept is the Synderesis principle, the idea that we have this innate drive and impulse to do good and avoid evil. And Aquinas believed that that would lead us to flourishing. So how do we actually do that? Well, he said that is by following 5 primary precepts. And these 5 primary precepts are universal, and that means they should be followed by everyone. And he believed that if everyone follows those 5 primary precepts, they will achieve flourishing. They will flourish in their lives, and they will then end up in heaven, which is where he believed we are wanting to go. It's known by him as the beatific vision, and it is a meeting with God. So he believed it's really important that those 5 primary precepts are universally followed so that we can achieve flourishing. And that leads us to the 4th key concept, which is the secondary precepts. And they are then the more specific rules about specific issues that are derived from the primary precepts. And they are those, as I say, particular rules about particular things that come from the primary precepts. And you need to use your God-given ability to reason in order to work those secondary precepts out. So unlike the 5 primary precepts, which are universal, those secondary precepts are subjective and they are relative. So just at the start of the video, I wanted to share with you those 4 key concepts to always keep in mind when you are talking about, and of course, when you're writing about natural moral law. Let's go back over 2,000 years now, shall we, and have a look at Aristotle's influence on Aquinas, because Aristotle is one of the most important and influential philosophers in human history. He's one of the founding fathers of Western philosophy, and he was very influential on Aquinas. And we are going to look at how he influenced Aquinas and how his ideas, how Aristotle's ideas were incorporated by Aquinas into his natural moral law. So as I've put here, Aquinas was hugely influenced by Aristotle's ideas, and he incorporated many of Aristotle's ancient Greek ideas into his Christian theology. And there are 3 that we need to know that you can refer to in the exam. The first one is Aristotle's idea of telos, because Aristotle believed that everything in the universe and the universe itself has a telos. He talked about everything having 4 causes, and the 4th of those 4 causes is the final cause, which is the purpose, the telos of that thing. And the word telos just means purpose. So it's the idea that everything and everyone has a telos to fulfill, and everything in its lifetime, everyone in their lifetime, is moving towards fulfilling that telos. So that applies to objects. So for example, a chair's telos is to provide somewhere for us to sit, isn't it? But it then also applies to people as well, because he believed that the purpose of human life is something called eudaimonia. That means flourishing and living well. So it means fulfilling your full potential. Now, Aquinas really liked this idea. He adapted it and he developed it by asserting that that telos is God-given. So remember, Aristotle predates Christianity, whereas Aquinas is obviously a Christian theologian from the 13th century. They really liked that idea of telos and purpose. So he said, okay, I'm going to take that idea, I'm going to use that idea, and I'm going to say that that telos actually comes from God. So he believed that everything and everyone has a God-given purpose, and that includes, of course, the universe. So we could then build on that by talking about eudaimonia, which, remember, is what Aristotle said is the purpose of human life. Because again, Aquinas really liked this idea. So for Aristotle, eudaimonia is human flourishing. It is the fulfillment of your potential. It's becoming the best that you can be and fulfilling, as I say, your full potential, achieving your very best. And Aristotle saw that as the purpose of human life. And again, this is something that Aquinas really liked. So he again adapted it and developed it, and he incorporated it into his natural moral law, because he says that we achieve flourishing by following his 5 primary precepts. So that is his blueprint, if you like, for flourishing. So he says, absolutely, the purpose of life is to flourish. It is to achieve eudaimonia, and you do that by following the 5 primary precepts. But, and this is very important, he says we cannot fully achieve eudaimonia within this lifetime, because, remember, if we link this to Christian beliefs about self-death and the afterlife, Christians do not believe that this lifetime is the only life that we have. They believe that after death, there is going to be, hopefully, eternal life in heaven. And Aquinas believed that it is only in heaven that we can fully achieve that eudaimonia, that we can fully achieve that flourishing, because that is when we will meet God. We will be with God for eternity. And he called that the beatific vision. So really important we note that Aristotle came up with eudaimonia, the idea of human flourishing. Aquinas really likes that, and he said, yes, I want my ethical theory to be about promoting flourishing, and that is going to be achieved through my 5 primary precepts. But he said you're not actually going to fully get to 100% flourishing during your earthly lifetime. That will only happen after death, when you're in heaven, hopefully with God. And then finally, the third really influential idea from Aristotle is this idea of reasoning and the human ability to reason. Because Aristotle believed that our human ability to reason is what distinguishes us from animals and plants. And he came up with a hierarchy of souls. And at the top of that hierarchy are human beings, because they have a rational soul. And that means they have that ability to think in that deeper way. They have that cognitive capability. They can think, they can reflect, they can question, they can philosophize. So he said that humans are at the very top of that hierarchy because they have a rational soul. And that just means they've got that ability to reason. The next tier down is where animals are found, because they have a sensitive soul, which is where they've got emotions, they've got impulses, but they're below humans because they don't have that ability to think in the same way. They don't have those complex thoughts. They don't have that ability to reflect, to philosophize, to ask questions in the same way. And then at the bottom of that hierarchy are plants, because they have a vegetative soul. So what is the important point to take away here? Well, the important point is that humans have got this very unique ability to reason, and that is what makes them very, very important. So Aristotle believed that we should use reason in order to understand the world, in order to understand our telos. And then, of course, Aquinas really likes this because he says, right, that ability to reason has come from God. It is a God-given ability. It reflects the fact we've been made imago Dei. And he said we need to then use that God-given ability to reason, because that will help us work out the natural law. Remember that quote that discovering the natural law means using right reason in accordance with nature. So he believed that our conscience is the God-given ability to reason. So a great link there to the conscience topic. And he in particular believed we should use reason to work out those secondary precepts. So They are three key ideas that are very influential on Aquinas: the idea of telos, eudaimonia, and reason. So let's have a look at how Aquinas incorporates and includes these within his natural moral law, shall we? We're going to start by looking at his 4 tiers of law, because Aquinas believed that there are 4 tiers of law. They are in a hierarchy that is ordered by importance, and each one of them is dependent on the one above. So the one at the very top is the eternal law, and this is the law as known in the mind of God. It's God's knowledge of right and wrong. We could call it his blueprint for morality. Now, really important to note that Aquinas says humans don't actually have any access to this. Remember, we are fallible, we are fallen, we cannot see into the mind of God. So we cannot actually know the eternal law, because that is within the mind of God. But it's an important tier because it is the top tier of law, and it shows us that morality is something to be discovered. We don't invent the law, we actually have to discover it because it is there in the mind of God. The next tier down then is where we do get a little glimpse of these laws, because it is the divine law. This is God's special revelation of his law, and it's disclosed through the Bible. So the divine law is when God then reveals certain rules, certain commandments in acts of revelation. For example, the 10 Commandments, which were revealed in the Old Testament, and then the teachings of Jesus. Because remember, Christians believe that Jesus is the incarnate Son of God. So the divine law is where that curtain is pulled back just a little bit, and God gives those special revelations. He gives his commandments, and Jesus delivers his teachings. For example, as I've put there, his Sermon on the Mount. So that is our next tier down, the divine law, where God reveals some of his divine commands and teachings. The third tier then is natural law. And this is God's law revealed through right reason. As we've said, reason is really important for Aquinas. He believes it is God-given. It's that unique human ability to think, reflect, question, consider. And we use right reason in accordance with our human nature. So remember, synderesis, the synderesis principle, is that impulse that Aquinas believes is given to us by God to want to do good and avoid evil, because that takes us on a path to flourishing and fulfillment. So natural law is about using right reason in accordance with nature, and so it means reflecting on what it means to do good and avoid evil. And this is where we then get those 5 primary precepts, because of course, remember, they are central to natural moral law, because we are reflecting on what it means to do good and avoid evil. And Aquinas says that leads us to 5 primary precepts that must be universally followed by all people. And then finally, at the bottom here, we have got the human laws. And the human laws are the system of laws built by human beings and human societies. So they are the rules and regulations for everyday life devised by governments. So they are at the bottom of the hierarchy, because they are then the individual specific rules that we create based on what has been revealed to us by those divine laws and what has been discovered by us in the natural laws. And here's an important point, that based on that hierarchy then, Aquinas believed that an unjust human law that violated natural law could actually be broken. You would be justified to do that because they're at the bottom of the hierarchy. So those human laws have got to be in accordance with the natural law, so with those 5 primary precepts, and with the divine law, with those 10 commandments and with the teachings of Jesus. So that hierarchy is important because it shows the importance of each tier of law and how we as human beings discover what we're supposed to be doing during our earthly lifetimes. So that then leads us to the synderesis principle and the precepts, because these are, as I said, key concepts 2, 3, and 4. We've got the synderesis principle, which is that innate instinct to do good and avoid evil. We then have the 5 primary precepts, which are supposed to be universally followed. And then we have the secondary precepts, which are our specific, particular rules that are derived from those 5 primary precepts. So let's talk through them. The overriding principle of natural moral law is the synderesis principle, to do good and avoid evil. Doing good means we will fulfill our telos and therefore achieve eudaimonia, which, as we've established, Aquinas believes is the purpose of life. Following on from this, we then have the 5 primary precepts, which are supposed to help us do that good and avoid evil. And then from these primary precepts, humans use reason to work out more specific rules for everyday life, and they are called the secondary precepts. And we'll look at how they're derived from the 5 primary precepts in a few moments' time. For now, though, let's just talk in more detail about the Synderesis principle. And it is so easy to remember. It is literally to do good and avoid evil. So there we go. In, one line, in literally 5 words there, we have summed up what the Synderesis principle is. Aquinas believed that all humans are by nature disposed to do good. Now, this is a very interesting opportunity for some critical analysis, because do all Christian scholars, do all Christian theologians agree with that? I would say absolutely they do not. If we think about Augustine's teachings on the fall, for example, he would be shaking his head and having a bit of a row with Aquinas, because the idea that we are disposed to do good goes against that Augustinian idea, doesn't it? That actually we have this within us tendency to sin. We have this original sin. So that's an interesting opportunity for some critical analysis as to whether Aquinas is actually right there in what he's saying about human nature. In terms of the Synderesis principle, he said that pursuing this good is achieved through following the 5 primary precepts, and that pursuing that good via those precepts leads to eudaimonia. It leads to that flourishing. And of course, for Aquinas, that is only fully achieved. We get 100% eudaimonia in heaven. Now, as part of this, it's really important to note that Aquinas makes the distinction between doing real goods and then pursuing apparent goods, because of course that word good has got a bit of ambiguity. I can't even say the word ambiguity. There we go, third time lucky. It's got some ambiguity to it, hasn't it? Because to say do good and avoid evil, we could ask, well, what does that actually mean? And he said there is a difference between doing real goods and then apparent goods. So a real good is a good that leads to fulfilling our God-given purpose and ultimately achieving eudaimonia. We know them by using right reason in accordance with nature. And no spoilers here, to do good means to follow the 5 primary precepts. So he said that a real good is one that leads to us fulfilling our God-given purpose and ultimately then, of course, achieving that eudaimonia. Whereas in contrast, an apparent good is the fact that humans are flawed and do fall short of God's intentions for them. So we do want to do good and avoid evil, but we struggle to do that. And again, you can see there that actually Augustine would quite like this, wouldn't he? Because he'd say, okay, Aquinas, you are now acknowledging that even though we do want to do good, we struggle to do that because of our fallen nature. And so as part of this, humans confuse what seems to be good with what is actually good. And this is so interesting, isn't it? Things that people think are good and that are going to bring them pleasure, for example, but actually are not. So the example that comes to my mind all the time, and I'm not saying you can't eat sweets, of course I'm not, but people might say, oh, a little child goes into a shop, you say, choose what you want, and they go for the sweets because they think that they're going to be good because they like the taste of them. But actually, the parent, the responsible adult, knows they can't actually buy out the entire range of Haribos in stock because it's not actually going to be good for them. So the child is confused, we could say, is ignorant, that's probably a better word, of what's actually good for them, because really they should be running to the fruit aisle, shouldn't they, and be getting all the apples, bananas and grapes. But they're not, because it's an apparent good, because they see the colours, they like the taste, so they want to buy all of the Haribo Star Mix. So they've confused what seems to be good with what is actually good. So those sweets might be enjoyable, but they're not going to lead to eudaimonia necessarily. Although I suppose if you think your purpose in life is to, eat loads of Haribos, who am I to judge? But the example I'm trying to use here, or the point I'm trying to make here, I should say, is that human beings can often confuse what they think is good for them with what is actually good for them. And so Aquinas is acknowledging that sometimes human beings do pursue apparent goods rather than real goods, which is why he's really clear about his 5 primary precepts, so there can be no ambiguity. I said it right that time. There can be no doubt about what goodness actually is. But, this provides us with some real clarity, doesn't it, on what good is. When he says to do good, he means to do things that will help fulfill your God-given purpose and then ultimately enable you to achieve eudaimonia. So how do we do that? What do we need to do? Well, he very kindly gives us these 5 primary precepts of natural law. and they are universal, which means he said they should be followed by all people, and he believed that they lead to human flourishing. Now, let's just think AO2-wise here. You need to start questioning, is he right that these are the 5 things you need to do in order to flourish as a human being? Has he missed something out? Has he included something that you actually don't think is necessary for flourishing? And I would also say to you, think about the fact that they are universal, because we could say that in a world of over 7 billion people, there might even be 8 billion people now, actually, depends when you're watching this video. We've got to ask, is that right, that all 8 billion people will achieve human flourishing in the same way? Is it correct that this blueprint needs to be followed by all people? We could argue, couldn't we, that actually flourishing is unique to different people. One person needs to do certain things in order to be happy and flourish, and another person needs to follow a different pathway. So that's quite interesting, and that's quite similar to religious pluralism, I suppose, and the idea there are different paths, aren't there, to the same destination. Is he right to say that they are universal and they need to be followed by all people at all times? You know, could it be, for example, that they were great when Aquinas came up with them in the 13th century, but now in the 21st century, they're actually quite outdated? So let me know what you think in the comments. So let's actually talk through them. The first one is preservation of life. It is natural and reasonable, and they are our key words when we're talking about natural moral law. It's about human nature, and it's about using reason for every person to be concerned with preserving their own being and preserving human life. And of course, secondary precepts that leads to are things like do not kill. Reproduction, then, it is natural and reasonable for human life to continue. This is, of course, consistent with the evolutionary purpose of life, which is to survive and reproduce. So Aquinas ahead of the game here, beating the theory of evolution, beating Charles Darwin here with this recognition that to reproduce is natural to us and it is part of our human nature. Although, of course, again, with some critical analysis here, we've got to ask, is that still relevant today when we've got overpopulation in the world? Does absolutely everybody need to reproduce or not? Important point that this precept has led to the Catholic Church condemning contraception. It's led to them saying that the purpose of sex is reproduction, so contraception is wrong. This, of course, also leads to Catholic teachings against homosexuality, because they say that it shows the purpose, the natural purpose of sex is to reproduce. Our next one, our third one, is the education of children. Humans are intellectual beings. Remember, they're at the top of Aristotle's hierarchy of souls because they've got that rational soul, and it is natural for us to learn. So again, that reflects that God-given ability to reason. The UN Convention of Human Rights, for example, now includes the right to an education. So again, more contemporary support for Aquinas's ideas. The fourth one is to live in an ordered society. So this reflects the fact humans are social beings, and that living in an ordered society means that we can, I should have drawn a slash there, we are able to fulfill our God-given telos, our purpose. So we need to live in an ordered society where there is structure, where there is respect, you know, where there is cooperation, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to then actually achieve eudaimonia. And finally, the fifth one, and this is an interesting one, I think this really gets the debate started actually, is worshipping God. Do we need to worship God in order to flourish as human beings? Obviously, our atheists, such as Richard Dawkins, would disagree with Aquinas here. But for Aquinas, as a man of faith, as a committed Christian, he believed that worshipping God is one of those 5 primary precepts. Interesting to think, is that in our nature? He's saying here that it is in our nature, our God-given nature, to worship God. And this means to recognize God as the creator of the universe and everything within it. So it means to live in a way that is in accordance with God's will. So it's not just when you're praying, but it's in everything that you're doing as well, that you're worshiping God, you're respecting his creation, you're giving glory to God, not only through the words that you say when you pray, but in the things that you do every day. So as I say, you know, AO2-wise, is Aquinas right about these 5 primary precepts? Are they all still relevant? Or could 1 or 2 of them be outdated, for example? So start to think about that. Do you think that any don't need to be there? Is there anything you'd actually add on? Has he missed something out that shows his ethical theory is now outdated because he's overlooked something that's actually very important for moral decision making today. And then what I would also ask you is, which one do you think is the most important? So if you had to actually rank them now in terms of the most important at the top and least important at the bottom, what judgment would you make here? But yeah, they are the 5 primary precepts of Aquinas's natural moral law. And they are all about obviously maximizing flourishing for individuals, but also for society. And he said that they need to be followed universally. Let's have a look then at the secondary precepts that those primary precepts then lead to, because the secondary precepts, remember, are derived from those primary precepts. They are those specific rules and laws about particular issues, and they are derived from the primary precepts. They vary between cultures and they allow for personal interpretations, because this is where you are using your God-given ability to reason to work out those specific rules. So they are derived from the primary precepts, and this is you then putting those primary precepts into practical action and application. And as I've just said, actually, they illustrate the practical application of the primary precepts. So just a couple of examples for you here that you can use in your essay. For the preservation of life, the secondary precepts are do not kill, which is also, of course, a divine law because it is one of the 10 commandments. It leads to the Catholic Church teaching that abortion and euthanasia is sinful. And a third one is that someone could become a doctor. They could use reason and say, right, one of the primary precepts is the preservation of life. That means I feel the purpose of my life is to become a doctor. So I'm actually going to go on and take on that job. Let's look at reproduction then. It leads to the Catholic view that homosexuality is sinful because it violates the primary precept of reproduction. It leads to their teaching that contraception is sinful because, as the Pope wrote in Humanae Vitae in 1968, every sex act must remain open to the transmission of life. And thirdly, that could then lead to someone becoming a parent. So again, they use reason. They say, right, well, a primary precept is reproduction. That means I need to reproduce. That means I'm going to become a parent and take that seriously. And then thirdly, ordering of society. That leads to rules and teachings such as that stealing is sinful and that lying is sinful. And it could also, in terms of the secondary precepts, lead to someone becoming a police officer or voting in democratic elections. So yeah, the secondary precepts are all about putting those primary precepts into action on an everyday level, if that makes sense. And as I say, this means that they do vary between cultures because there is room for personal interpretation. It's about you as an individual making those judgments and decisions. So you are using reason to interpret and apply those primary precepts. So I suppose that shows, doesn't it, if we think AO2 wise here, that whilst there is a universal element to natural moral law, there is also then some flexibility within it as well. So does it have the best of both worlds, that there are some clear precepts, but then they can be flexibly applied? Just a little AO2 thought for you there. We're going to have a look now at a more contemporary version of natural moral law, because this was all developed, wasn't it, by Aquinas in the 13th century, although, as we've said, natural moral law predates even that and goes back 2,000 years. But then if we have a look at a much more recent development, this is John Finnis's idea. And he had this 20th century development of natural moral law. And he agreed that ethics should be about facilitating human flourishing. So he agreed with Aristotle and he agreed with Aquinas. And he said that in order for us to flourish as individuals, to achieve our full potential, we need to live in a civilized society that upholds what he called basic goods. So instead of having 5 primary precepts, he comes up with 7 basic goods. So, you know, when I was asking you before, do you think Aquinas has covered everything or have he missed something out? Well, maybe you might think that Finnis has covered more, that Finnis has got it right in terms of the things we need to do in order to flourish. So he comes up with, as I say, his 7 basic goods for flourishing that are universal and apply to all people. So I want you to think, do you think he has got a better list here than Aquinas's 5 primary precepts? So if we compare Aquinas's 5 precepts with Finnis's basic goods, do you think that this is a better development of natural moral law? Who is more successful? Let's talk through them, shall we? His first one is life, and within that he includes health and procreation. His second one is knowledge, so again, the importance of reason. His third one that Aquinas didn't cover is play. We need that ability for recreation and to let off a bit of steam. His fourth one is aesthetic experience. His fifth is sociability, including friendship, so the importance of socializing, again reflecting that humans are social beings. Number six is practical reason. We need that ability to use our reasoning in order to work things out, to make judgments, to reflect. And then seven, religion/spirituality. So this is interesting because could this one be more appealing to an atheist? Because he's not said worship of God. He said we need some form of religion or spirituality. So even if that's not worshiping God in that traditional Christian sense, you need some kind of spiritual life. And people find that today, don't they, through things like mindfulness, through yoga, through meditation, through law of attraction. I don't know. So is this list, do you think, a better list? Has he improved on Aquinas's natural moral law here? So as I've put at the bottom, in terms of our critical analysis, do you think Finis is right about these basic goods? Are these 7 goods better than Aquinas's 5 precepts? So you could use this, obviously, in an essay to talk about it being a more contemporary version. You could say it's a better version. It shows that natural moral law is actually still relevant. You could, of course, use it to critique Aquinas as well and say why Aquinas is wrong, because Finis has got a more comprehensive and complete list of the things we need to do in order to flourish. But I think a great point to focus on here is he doesn't require worshipping of God. So this could be a more appealing version of natural moral law in the 21st century because it doesn't depend on that belief in God. Let's have a look now at the doctrine of double effect, which is developed by Aquinas, and it is relevant in situations where a single action has 2 effects. Remember, he said nothing hinders one action from having 2 effects. Only one of them that was intended. So the doctrine of double effect is really important as an important part of his ethics because it's about focusing on what we are held responsible for. He says that we are responsible for what we intended, to do. So when it comes to an action that has 2 effects, we are responsible for the one that we intended to do. So this is important. Aquinas says that we need to make a distinction between intention and foresight. So when you do something, you have an intention, which is what you intend to do, what you want to do. But alongside that, you can have foresight of what will also happen as a side effect of your action. And he says it is the effect that you intended that matters. So as I say, we've got your intention and then we've got an unintended side effect. And he said we have to make a distinction between the two and we have to hold people responsible for the thing they intended to do. So even if they have foresight of a side effect that will happen as well, they are only to be held responsible for what they intended to do. And the easiest way to think about this is with this example here, the killing of an attacker in self-defense. So Aquinas used this example himself, actually, which is why it is great. He said, your intention is to defend yourself and preserve your life. So that obviously upholds the primary precept for the preservation of life. He said that an unintended side effect of this is that the attacker is killed. So if you strike out at them in self-defense, your intention there is not to kill them. That is the unintended side effect. Your intention in doing that is not, I want to kill them. Your intention in doing that is, I want to defend myself. So he says, if you strike out to defend yourself from an attacker, your intention is that you want to preserve your life, which is a good thing. It upholds the primary precept of preservation of life. He said you can then have an unintended side effect and you can have foresight of that because you can know that in defending yourself as an unintended side effect, that person may well die. But he says you are not morally responsible for that, because you have the intention to defend yourself and preserve your life, which is morally good. So if as an unintended side effect, they do then lose their life, you don't need to worry. Your action is actually morally justified because your intention was to defend yourself rather than to kill the attacker. Obviously, if you'd struck out with the intention of, I'm going to kill you, how dare you attack me, that would change the game. But for Aquinas, he says intention is everything. So it's the effect that you intended that matters, and you should be held to account for. There are other important examples you can use, such as treating uterine cancer and tactical bombing as well. So this does apply to many different ethical areas, and you've got to think about when it can be invoked. And it is relevant, as I've said, in situations where a single action has two effects to it. So in terms of your AO2 here, you've got to think, well, does the doctrine work? Is Aquinas right to say that it's only your intentions you should be held morally responsible for? Or actually, should you be held responsible for all of the effects of your actions? So even if it wasn't your intention to kill the attacker, if they do die as a result of your action, should you not be held morally responsible for that? That's the question you've got to ask. So is Aquinas right that we should judge actions by their intentions, or are the outcomes more important? So something to think about there, and obviously something to apply there in terms of his doctrine of double effect. One more development then for us today on natural moral law is proportionalism. And this is a contemporary development of natural moral law by scholars such as Bernard Huss. And he sums it up like this. He said, it is never right to go against a principle unless there is a proportionate reason that would justify it. So to put this another way, you should always follow the moral laws unless there is a proportionate reason not to. And that proportionate reason is based on the context or situation. So this is important because natural moral law obviously has those 5 fixed primary precepts. And you could say it is quite a demanding ethical theory, saying that we have to follow and uphold these precepts in our lives. And so proportionalism is about recognizing that there may sometimes be significantly exceptional, shall we say, circumstances when you can actually push the rules aside in order to do the right thing. So as Vardy and Grotch wrote, the situation must be significantly unusual and of sufficient magnitude to provide a reason which would overturn what would otherwise be a firm rule. So the point here is you should always follow the rules, you should always follow the principles unless you have a proportionate reason not to. So it's basically saying that 9 times out of 10, natural law should be followed. But there are exceptional circumstances, there are proportional reasons to actually push that aside as an exception. So remember, you should always follow the moral laws unless there is a proportionate reason not to. And I can see I've actually not put that on the PowerPoint, which is terrible of me. I meant to put here, you should always follow. I'm going to try and write the word follow, but it's just not going to write it, is it? There we go. I'm just going to circle it. I meant to put there, you should always follow the moral laws unless there is a proportionate reason not to. And that is the idea that in exceptional circumstances, you can actually break a rule, you can go against a precept as you try to do the greater good. And this is trying to add a little bit more flexibility into natural moral law, because one of the criticisms is that it's too rigid, it's too demanding. And this is saying, well, hang on, it is important that it has those strict principles and precepts to follow, but there is an exception that can sometimes be made. And that's when there is a proportionate reason to actually not follow the rule. In terms of our AO2 for this then, it has been criticised by many Catholic theologians because, of course, it could potentially justify anything. What do we mean when we say a proportionate reason? People could say anything is a proportionate reason. And you could say that becomes a slippery slope to anything being justified by anyone. Catholic theologians also criticise this because they say there are some things that are intrinsically evil, which means that they are bad within themselves. So it's not about the situation you're in or the context you're in. There are certain things that are always wrong. And so there is never a proportionate reason. For example, rape, we could use as an example there. The Catholic Church says a lot of things are intrinsically evil, though, things like contraception. You know, so you could say, if we actually have a concrete example of this, something like contraception, you could say, well, is there a proportionate reason to use it? Because of course it would go against the primary precept for reproduction. And you could say, well, when there is a spread of things like HIV and AIDS and other STIs, then yeah, absolutely, that's the proportionate reason to allow contraception. But the Catholic Church would say, well, no, because contraception is intrinsically evil, that it should never, ever be used. And so that's a great example you can use in your essay of the Catholic Church standing firm and saying that you can't start making exceptions when it comes to morality. You have to stand firm and be really strict in holding to those set rules and principles. So now we've had a look at all our AO1 and those more contemporary developments, let's have a look at our AO2, shall we? We're going to look at the strengths of natural moral law and then the weaknesses of natural moral law. So you can then make a judgment as to whether you think it is a good approach to moral decision making and ethics. We're going to start with our strengths, and I've got 3 strengths to talk you through. Let's start with John Waters, who we spoke about at the beginning. He said natural moral law is good because it provides a foundational, universal and absolute approach to ethics. So, for example, the primary precepts provide clarity and consistency for moral decision making. Natural moral law applies across time and culture. As Cicero said, there is one law eternal, binding upon all people at all times. He said there shouldn't be one law in Athens and one law in Rome. It should be one law eternal for all people to follow. You could say that idea of a universal moral law is appealing to many people. It means you don't get confused, and it means you've got consistency in the moral judgments that people are making. So, you know, if you go to another country, you are very clued up on how you should be behaving, and you're not going to end up in court for doing something that they don't allow in that country, because everybody shares the same standards for morality, and they are the 5 primary precepts. So it makes, you know, life easier, you could say, because you have consistency, you have clarity. We could then say it has consistency with flexibility, which we mentioned before about having those fixed primary precepts, but then those subjective secondary precepts. So we could say it has the best of both worlds. So whilst the primary precepts can be universally followed, and they should be, shouldn't they, according to Aquinas, there is still flexibility in the form of those secondary precepts. They vary within different societies and they allow for personal interpretations. And we can say that is a good thing because it means natural moral law remains relevant and applicable in the modern world today in different societies and different cultures. And remember, you work out those secondary precepts based on the primary precepts using reason. And we can say that that is a good thing because the emphasis on reason is empowering. Natural moral law treats humans as rational agents who can think for themselves. That is a good thing because it empowers the individual as a moral decision maker. You could also say it values human beings and link that to Aristotle's hierarchy of souls and the rational soul at the top. This is also, of course, seen in Aquinas' doctrine of double effect, which takes the agent's intentions into account. You could say we're not meant to be moral robots. It does actually take into account what you were thinking, what you were intending. However, if we do a bit of critical analysis here, as you must do for an 8-star, we've got to ask, are human beings actually capable of reasoning clearly? So again, those questions about, is he too optimistic about human nature? Could the doctrine of double effect actually be exploited? So if you're giving people the ability to think for themselves and reason for themselves, we can say, well, that's a good thing because it gives the agent moral autonomy, but is there then the risk of exploitation there? And could there be problems that arise from that as well? Talking of problems then, let's look at our weaknesses. And the number one that I would be using is that it depends on belief in God, which means that in 21st century society, it might be seen as outdated as an ethical theory, because it assumes that there is a God who has created the world. He's not only created the world, he's created morality as well. So it's the idea, and again, link it to metaethics, that all morality comes from God. And then if we go even further, so obviously that's problematic for atheists in itself. But if we go even further and say, well, one of the 5 primary precepts, which we're told you have to follow in order to flourish, is worshipping God. And of course, an atheist isn't going to do that, and they're not going to believe they need to do that in order to flourish. So you could argue that you don't need to worship God in order to flourish or achieve eudaimonia. And you can certainly say that, you know, For atheists today, this means it's not going to be an appealing theory. It's not an appealing approach to ethics, because they aren't going to worship God and they aren't going to believe that will lead to them flourishing. We could also say it's outdated on issues such as sex ethics. So the primary precept of reproduction, for example, has led to the Catholic Church banning contraception and condemning homosexual relationships. You could say this shows that they are out of touch and that natural moral law is outdated in the 21st century, because in the world today, contraception is widely used and homosexual relationships have been legalized. You could say this shows that Aquinas' natural moral law is outdated and unhelpful today. So as I was asking you before, of those 5 primary precepts, are they all still relevant? Should they all still be followed or not? And you could say, well, reproduction, for example, is outdated. We've got 8 billion people in the world now. Overpopulation is a problem. Is it true that every single person needs to reproduce in order to flourish? And, you know, this leads then to the fact that it is too absolutist. The Catechism of the Catholic Church says that natural law is universal in its precepts. You could say that actually, whilst that's a good thing, and we said it was a strength because it provides that universal, foundational, and absolute approach to ethics. Thank you, John Waters, for that. We could say the problem with that is that it's then assuming everyone needs to do exactly the same things in order to flourish. Different people may have different ideas about how to flourish and achieve eudaimonia. Natural moral law assumes we should all follow the same path. And we could say, look, Jesus didn't reproduce, Jesus didn't have kids, St. Paul didn't have kids. Different people flourish in different ways. We're not saying that Jesus hasn't gone to heaven. Obviously, he's back in heaven, even though he didn't reproduce whilst he was on earth. Of course, because he was the Son of God, so he is going to go back to heaven. But, you know, aside from that, are we really saying that everyone has to do these 5 things in order to flourish? Aquinas would say, yeah, but you can have, and you can make a really strong argument here that it's too absolutist, and it's assuming that everybody flourishes in the same way. I've added there, haven't I, a bit of critical analysis. You could say, well, maybe John Finnis's modern development resolves that. So you could then actually come back on that with a counter argument and say, well, yeah, maybe Aquinas is a bit narrow, but Finnis adequately and successfully resolves that problem. So actually that weakness can be refuted because a more contemporary version that developed by Finnis has resolved that problem by having 7 basic goods that don't require the worship of God, rather than those 5 primary precepts. So that brings today's video to an end. Thank you very much for joining me. I hope that's been helpful. Just want to wish you the very best of luck with your studies and have a great day. Bye-bye.